Hello, you're listening to The Chronicles, the podcast of the Centre for Viking and Medieval Studies at Aarhus University. I'm Richard Cole. In the middle of the 600s, virtually nobody in Christendom had heard of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers. 100 years later, by around the early 700s, the Prophet's successors had established a mighty state, stretching from Morocco and Spain in the west to the Indus River in the east, gobbling up the previously Byzantine cities of North Africa and the Middle East along the way. This state, and this enduring idea of a state, was called the Caliphate. In today's Europe, Muslims are sometimes accused of being sexually conservative, out of step with the liberated, hedonistic sexual mores of secular European society. But in the early medieval period, sources suggest there were diverse forms of sexual experience and expression in the Caliphate. This was, after all, a society which was much more urbanized than most of Christian Europe, and a society which had incorporated large quantities of saucy Greek learning from its conquered populations. A man about town in the Caliphate might be quite the Casanova, and indeed many Arab and Persian intellectuals left behind writings which allow us to reconstruct the sex lives of medieval Muslims in impressive detail. Joining me to talk about sex and the Caliphate is Pernilla Myrne, senior lecturer in the Department of Languages and Literatures and author of Female Sexuality in the Early Medieval Islamic World, Gender and Sex in Arabic Literature, amongst other titles. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Pernilla.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's lovely to see you in Aarhus again. I'm going to start by asking you a question that everybody is being asked on this podcast. What does the Middle Ages mean to you? Is there some sort of medieval spirit? Is there some sort of continuity to the period? Or is it artificial and not really relevant?
Okay, thank you. It's a quite difficult question for me because the Middle Ages is a European concept. It's good to be able to compare the Islamic world with Europeans. So as scholars of Islamic history, we have to adapt to European concepts in many ways. But still, periodization in Islamic history is often done along dynasties. Some historians use the concept of medieval, and I did in my book. So, and that would be from the early, from 900 to the beginning of the 16th century, when the Middle East was conquered by the Ottoman Empire.
So before the Ottomans, you might talk about something being medieval.
And for me, this time period, because the early period is from the Islamic conquest from the Prophet Muhammad until 900. And for me, this period after 900 until 1500, it's, for me personally, what I think is most important is the Arabization. People started to speak Arabic.
It was like lots of people had been incorporated into the Caliphate.
Yes.
But to start with, they weren't all Arabs, right?
No, they weren't.
Greeks and Berbers.
Absolutely.
And Persians.
They spoke different languages. Yeah. And of course, some of them in the eastern parts continue to speak Persian and other languages. But Arabic became a major language, both for speaking in the western parts and for literature and for religious sciences. So for someone like me, who's an Arabist, it's possible to read literature written from the 9th century until today, from a huge part of the world. And covering many disciplines and genres. So this is important. Another thing that happened in this time period is the Islamization.
So they're not just learning to speak Arabic.
No, it's during this time that the majority became Muslims in parts of, not all parts, but parts of the Islamic Caliphate or the Islamic world, so to speak. It took some 100 years before the majority in Iraq became Muslims, and that was in the 10th century.
Okay.
Yes. And also, they established an Islamic orthodoxy. Before the 900 was the formative period of Islam in many aspects, in legal literature and other aspects of Islam. But after 900, you see the establishment of an Islamic orthodoxy. There were always variant interpretation of Islam, of course, but the Islam adopted by the rulers, many rulers, like the caliphs and many of the sultans, and later the Ottoman sultans, the Sunni Islam. Another thing that was important too is that the figures of early Islam from the early 700 until 900 were extremely important in history writing.
The figures?
The important persons.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So a sort of canon starts to emerge.
Yes.
From the 700s, as early as the 700s to the 900s.
Yeah.
So we've got these three dynasties, right? You've got the Rashidun, the dynasty of the immediate kind of successors of the Prophet. Then you've got the Umayyads, and then you've got the Abbasids, right? They're the third dynasty.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the Abbasids later.
Yeah, okay.
They're very important. And the caliphs from the early Abbasid dynasty, the most perhaps famous is Harun al-Rashid. They were not only important figures in history writing, but also in literature. Take, for example, Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. The earliest evidence of this compilation is from the 9th century. And then several of the stories are from the 9th century. They became legendary. The people who populated Baghdad, like Harun al-Rashid, the caliph, and his friends, and the poet Abu Nuwas, his wife Zubaydah. There were stories about them that were narrated until today.
Okay, yeah. So there's this kind of resonating through history.
Yes,
right?
a legendary caliphate.
Yes, fantastic. I think this leads me quite nicely. We've talked in general about the medieval and the Middle Ages, but the topic at hand, which is our interest in sex and the Caliphate. So what sort of sources do we have for sexuality, the history of sexuality in the Islamic world? What, are we looking at erotic manuals, medical texts, law, poetry? What sort of texts can we get hold of if we're interested in this subject?
All of the genres that just mentioned.
Okay, yeah, I've said too much.
Yeah. There is a huge corpus of literature, several genres talking about sex in different ways. So that is something that is really great for me as a scholar of sexuality now, that there are so many sources, so many genres talking about sex. It was something that people could write about explicitly. There was no shame surrounding it. Writing about it.
Yeah.
Most importantly, I think, for me, is the genre of erotic manuals that was influenced by the Indian erotic manuals like Kama Sutra.
Okay.
But
so these really are how-to guides, essentially. How to take a lover, how to satisfy a lover. And that kind of
advice manuals for men, and perhaps sometimes also for women, but they were written for men. And so they were both advice manuals and technical manuals, sexual technique, but also added a lot of sexual medicine and natural philosophy, ideas about sex. Different variants of sexual manuals. Some of them were more medical.
Okay.
Others were more entertaining, with a lot of poetry and anecdotes. And others were more educational.
What about time periods for writing about sex? Was this something that people in the Islamic world started doing fairly early, or is it from the 900s onwards that writing about sex becomes permissible or enjoyable or just commonplace in the Islamic world?
Yes, and actually we don't know so much about the literature before the 9th century. There's some texts preserved from the 8th century, but it's practically only the Quran and perhaps some documents and some, quotations in later literature that was transmitted orally. But the large writing It was a kind of revolution, a revolution of book revolution and writing in the early Abbasid Caliphate, especially in the 9th century and 10th century. And we have a huge amount of scientific literature translated from Greek and Persian, and also some Indian languages, and also new literature written in Arabic. Science and literature and so on. So this is a great time period for sources on sex. But we have also from later periods, we have preserved erotic manuals written in the 10th century, in the 12th century, in the 13th century, in the 14th century, in the 15th century. And the last one that I found when I've been looking at manuscripts was written in the 17th century. But the manuscript circulated. So the older literature circulated later on.
Right. One could potentially be reading a manual in the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s that was originally written in the 900s. Right?
Yes.
That's a thing that would not be surprising. Yeah, okay.
No.
And that's actually, I think that's something you see with medieval Europe as well, right? In the Christian world, where Augustine is writing there in the 400s, but everyone is still citing him all the time in the 1500s, as though he wrote it yesterday. Yeah. Right? It's this sense of continuity that we don't have today. Could you give us an example of medieval writing about sex from the Caliphate, something that might give us a flavour of the sorts of things about which one could talk in the early medieval Islamic world?
I have chosen two short extracts from the earliest erotic manual, which is called Encyclopedia of Pleasure, which is really an encyclopedia. And these are pieces of advice for men. So this is the kind of, he writes for men who want to be refined, and he writes about good behavior towards women.
Interesting.
And then I also choose a poem, not from the Caliphate, because it's from the 13th century Iran.
Okay.
But I think it gives a good view, good picture of poetry from early poetry as well. Great. So I will talk more about it.
Love to hear it.
So first, the two pieces from Encyclopedia of Pleasure. Advice for men. The man must make himself look as attractive as possible to the woman. He should not treat her roughly and demand sex at the first meeting. Instead, he should embolden her as much as he can with the help of humor and playfulness in a way that is sensitive to her feelings and makes her happy. He should be cautious not to be intimate with her with disheveled hair and beard. He should comb his beard and perfume his body and head, so to make it possible for her to enjoy his body. And then a little later he writes, know that women prefer a man who knows how to behave well in all circumstances and how to be in harmony with them. They reject a man who has no knowledge about women and won't love him even if he's exceptionally handsome and rich. Then again, they would love a poor man devoid of praiseworthy manners as long as he is well informed about women and knows how to be in harmony with them. Therefore, the man has to endeavour so that her orgasm, that is ejaculation literally, coincides with his at the first sexual encounter.
That took a turn quite fast. Yeah, okay, carry on.
That will make her heart favourably disposed to him, and is the most powerful way of strengthening love between them. If it happens from the beginning, their love will last and their affection be complete. So this is kind of alchemy of love. Both the man and the woman have seed or sperm.
Right.
They have to mingle.
In his view, yes.
Not only in his view, the Greek medical writers, because the seed has, this is this two-seed theory.
Right,
no?
Okay.
Both the man and the woman have sperm, and they have to mingle in order to reproduction to take place. Okay?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good theory. So because the child has something from the man, and something from the father, and something from the mother, and that is because the child has
something from both of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But this author also believes that it creates love between them, so it's kind of an alchemy of love.
It's quite
the
sweet,
mingling
really.
of it. Isn't it? Yeah. So they have this concept of female orgasm or female ejaculation early on.
But it's interesting that in that text, in the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, the sort of sexual element is not so clearly delineated from just being a gentleman, right? Or am I right about that? Yes.
He's a sexual gentleman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and he wants women to love him.
Yeah,
he wants them to adore him. And that's really important. Mm. But I also want to read the poem.
Please.
Because it says a lot about how the kind of literature from this period, that it's often very sexually explicit in a way that may be shocking to us, to modern people.
All right, so listeners have been warned.
Yeah. Because it was possible to talk about sex in a kind of vulgar way. That it was a genre of its own called mujun in Arabic. Explicit talk about sex, often in a vulgar way. But here the poet mixes it with more beautiful depiction of love, a love affair between two people. And these persons happen to be men. And it's written by the Persian poet Saadi, who is one of the most famous classical Persian poets. He was born 1209 or 1210 from Shiraz. And it's translated by Domenico Ingenito. So this is not well known today. His other poems are. He's still considered one of the most famous Persian classical poets. But this kind of poetry has been more difficult for modern people to accept.
Interesting. So we've got an example here of something, Saadi of Shiraz, you said, who absolutely could say this stuff in the 1200s, but it's been less acceptable today, as you say. All right, well, we'd love to hear it.
It starts beautifully. So it's quite long. How delightful it is to indulge in pleasure with a sugar-lipped beauty. Scarlet cheeks like cherries, a body as white as jasmine. Night and day, companions in the alcove and in the market. A man when in public, but like a wife when at home. At times politely contemplating each other while composed, like the cypress trees standing amidst the meadows. Other times so passionately lying in each other's embrace, as if only one shirt were needed for our bare bodies. The brush so tightly struck into the make-up case, like a candle firmly pressed into the lantern. A rod sliding entirely up to his navel, with our sperm running down my tights. The golden throne of the king does not shine as gracefully as the back of a boy whose body is as white as silver. Will I be satisfied by just one kiss? God forbid. Someone like me would never utter these words. A strike in the middle of two buttocks is much better than 70 kisses on one's lips. Tell my enemies that these are my truthful words, so that they may not make up their own stories.
Gosh. I mean, it's really powerful writing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's beautiful and explicit.
Yeah, it certainly is.
And it's proud of it.
Oh, that's the question I was going to ask you. It doesn't seem as though he's trying to hide that this is love between two men, particularly. No? Yeah. No.
He didn't want to, he didn't need to hide it.
Right. And this, tell my enemies, it's really, yeah.
Because there are people who are against this.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, there are people who don't like it.
Yeah.
But there are enough people who think it's okay.
Yeah. It will lead me to my next question, which is, what sorts of sexual relationships do we know people engaged in during the Caliphate? We've just seen men and men, for example, but I'm thinking sort of married and unmarried, women and women, free and unfree. What sort of relationships were possible? Do we know something about that?
According to legal norms, or Islamic religious and legal norms, only marriage and concubinage was possible. And that is a man and his wife or female slave.
Okay, so that's the official what's okay.
That's the official, but still, these other kind of relationships were semi-official because they didn't hide it, as you saw here. And back to Encyclopedia of Pleasure, this 10th century erotic manual, it has a large section on different relationships, different ways of being together.
Different configurations.
Yes, for lovers. Yeah. And he starts with man-woman. And then there are different types of man-woman relationships. And the first are legal marriage. And the other is a man and his female slaves, because men were allowed to have sexual relationships with a female slave.
Okay.
And we can talk more about that later. And the third was a man and a woman who were not married. Lovers.
Yeah.
So that was possible. That was okay, but dangerous, he says. People should avoid it because the woman might have a father or brothers who were against this. So It could be dangerous. It's better to marry.
Okay.
And he was a Shiite. And the Shia also allowed temporary marriage, which was much more easy.
Right.
Because they didn't. The woman didn't have to have witnesses. They didn't have to have her father's or her father's permission to marry.
How long could these temporary marriages be issued for?
He said it could be for some hours, up to a lifetime.
Okay. All right. That's a very useful and elastic concept, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then we have men relationships. And they could also be different. It could be man, and man, adolescent boy. And we can talk more about that later. And there were also male prostitutes. And then the third constellation is a woman.
Right.
So, and that was in the 10th century. And this author, he just described these kind of relationships. He doesn't condemn anything. Everything is possible. And then we see it again in the 12th century, and there is an author in the early 14th century called Tefashi from Tunis, who also lived in Egypt. And he really depicts a kind of sexual underworld. Which kind of seems like everybody had extramarital sex in his view. So it continued, and he also depicted female and male relationships. So that was something people were aware of all the time, I think.
Yeah. Until
modernity.
Right. Okay. That's the point. That's something that I hope we'll get back to, the change that happens with modernity. I'm going to tread very carefully here because it's a sensitive issue, of course. You mentioned the issue of men and adolescent boys. The medieval Christian world, which is the world that I know probably best, there it was a frequent accusation in religious polemic against the Islamic world when Christians wanted to say something horrible about Muslims, which they, didn't do all the time, but they certainly sometimes did that. That was something that they alighted upon, accusations of pederasty, essentially. Was there a particular Islamic attitude to pederasty? Was this something that the pre-Islamic Arabs had done? Was it something that had sort of been rediscovered when Greek culture was sort of taken over by the Caliphate? Was society divided on the issue of whether this was okay?
Society was definitely divided, and in the earliest, there is no evidence that it occurred in the middle of the 8th century. That is the Abbasids. So it wasn't something that was common or even occurred, officially before that in the early Islamic society. Absolutely not. So the official male homosexuality came with the Abbasids. And an Abbasid author like Jahiz, who was an Arab intellectual in Baghdad in the middle of the 9th century, he writes that it came with the Persians. So about the Abbasids revolution started in the east of Great Iran, the borders to Afghanistan and Turkmenistan today, and borders to Pakistan today. And he writes that it was the Arab soldiers who were sent there. They were the ones who started the Abbasid revolution, and they were sent to these parts where this practice was common, according to him, and because they didn't have their wives with them, so they started to practice homosexuality and took it back with them. That's his explanation. And still we can see all today, or in modern time, modern scholars who claim that it's a Persian practice. Yeah? But on the other hand, it was not uncommon in the area conquered by the Arabs before Christianity. And perhaps it continued in some parts all the time. So we don't know actually, but there is no evidence before the middle of or late 8th century.
That's quite interesting. I mean, this Abbasid revolution, as you've called it, as you referred to it, and it really is a revolutionary movement, right? And they have uniforms, they wear black, right, and have these flags, and the basic. I mean, for the listeners, please do correct me if I'm wrong here, Pernilla, but the basic idea is that all these people have been converting to Islam, in the run of the 800s across the Muslim world, but they've not been being accepted as proper Muslims by the elite, right? And the Abbasids say, no, it's okay. You can be a Muslim and you can be Persian, and you can be a Muslim and you can be Berber, and we're going to accept you all as sort of real Muslims, as it were. But that potentially is also the movement that sees liberalization of this practice that some people see as un-Islamic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the Abbasid culture was very influenced by Persian culture in many ways. So that's something new. But in the beginning, those who practiced pederasty were an urban elite. We know some poets and what do you call them, men of the world in Abbasid Baghdad and other urban centers. So it was not universally accepted. Then something happened that made it more accepted in broader areas of society, and that is the Sufi. And Sufis are the mystical, spiritual branch of Islam. Some groups started to practice something they call nazar, looking at beautiful youths, as contemplating their beauty as a way of experience the beauty of the divine. And that started not in a large scale, but in a large scale in the 11th century. So that became more and more common. So pederasty was somehow associated with Sufis, but we don't know if they actually have sex or not.
Right.
But
they might just be beholding.
Absolutely. But from the 11th century on, or perhaps a bit earlier, the most love poetry, written first in Arabic and later in Persian and even later in Ottoman Turkish, was homoerotic. A man writing about a younger man.
These adolescent boys who are the objects of this erotic desire, are they free or unfree? Is it something that you sort of only really do with a slave boy, or is it something that, I'm thinking of the Greeks here, someone who might themselves grow up to be a young gentleman, a man about town, might have a sort of, of course, in modern society would totally reject all this, but a sort of apprenticeship period, if you like. These adolescent boys, are they slaves, or can they also be of free status?
In the 9th century, the early Abbasids, they were predominantly slaves, and later on, I guess both, because it's often difficult to distinguish between slaves and free slaves, and and free. And for example, the Mamluk society from 1250, who was actually a slave aristocracy.
Yes, this
slave
is in
military
Egypt.
aristocracy. Precisely. So the Sultan was a former freed slave. So the distinction between slaves and free was a bit blurred.
Was there a divide between those who had more conservative and those who had more permissive sexual attitudes? Is this something that maps onto, say, rural and urban divides? People in the towns are more sexually liberated, and people out on the countryside will have more of a tendency to say, no, erotic love should only be between two married people or a man and his concubines, for example.
Yeah, I think we could say that generally, if we look at this time period in general, of course there are exceptions, of course, but we can't go into that. But in general, yes, there's urban, rural divide. But one interesting thing in this division is that the urban centers were governed by Sharia law, whereas the countryside, the villages, were often governed also by customary law when it came to sexual norms. I give an example of that is that in Sharia, if someone committed adultery or fornication, the judge needed to have 4 witnesses. And the witnesses had to have seen the actual act, okay? And the witnesses had to be male, Muslim, and not minor. And they also have to have good sense, good judgment. So they were deemed to have good judgment. And they have to be 4. And it's not often, it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, you need 4 people to burst into the bedroom, right? In order to, and they all have to be, good Muslims of good sense and good family. Yeah.
So actually, if we look at history writing from this period, we don't have many documents left. But what we have, there is practically no evidence of anyone sentenced to death. Because that's the strongest sentence. If you commit adultery or fornication, you're sentenced to death by stoning.
In Sharia law.
There's some details about, differences between if you're free or not, or married or not, or so on. But the harshest punishment was death. But it practically never happened. It was very difficult. Whereas in the villages or countryside, who were governed by, long before Islam, honor, like an honor culture, it was enough with the rumor. So women were much more guarded in the countryside, I think. Generally.
Because they didn't want a rumor going round that they'd been adulterous, and then it could end. And in this customary law in the Islamic world, although the customary law is pre-Islamic, as you know it, also there could be a death sentence for sexual misconduct? Or?
Well, relatives could kill, a father or brothers could kill someone, a brother or sister or son or daughter who committed a sex, or who was accused for committing a sexual act. There wasn't. Okay. And they would be excused by the elder in the village, or the village sheikh, to say.
Yeah.
But we don't know so much about this.
Right.
Because it's not written down. Okay.
So we're going on very little here. Yeah. That's the general strokes. How far was it considered possible by these sorts of people who we're talking about here, these kind of men about town or men of the world, the people who were having these different erotic adventures, how possible was it for them to think of themselves as being good Muslims as well as being adventurous lovers? And, were those two things in tension in their minds, or were they able to reconcile those ideas?
I think so, but others would not agree. And of course, it's different in different time periods because it becomes stricter. Right. In the 10th century, it was more possible. And it depends on what kind of sexual relations they had, perhaps. Not with married women.
Yeah. That one's kind of never okay, I'm assuming. Yeah.
But prostitution was permitted.
Okay, yeah.
In many of these societies.
Right. And not necessarily in tension with being seen as sort of pious and right-believing.
I guess many would seen it as non-pious.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. You're not going to have an amazing career as an Islamic scholar after you've been at the bordello, it sounds like.
Yeah, but still we have some Islamic scholars who write homoerotic poetry, for example. But because that was a poetic cliché. Right. Perhaps we don't know if they actually had relations with men.
Okay, interesting. I mean, the sources so far seem to have had a clearly male voice, right? Male poets, male physicians, playboys. How far is it possible in your research to access women's own thoughts about pleasure?
It's quite difficult, as all authors that have been preserved, their writing has been preserved, are male. So women are only quoted secondhand. There are women poets, but I think that along with Islamic orthodoxy, official sex or gender segregation became harsher. We don't know about in practice, but we see it in literature, that less women are quoted later on. So most voices that we hear are from the earliest centuries. And then I think they become less and less. That's my experience, at least. So, but it's difficult, but it's possible, I think. But we have to be cautious.
The basic, sounds as though, from what you're saying, the basic problem is that, yes, we've got women poets, but they're always being quoted by men.
Exactly. But from what we have, and also from, travelers later on, not from the medieval period, but European travelers who write about their experience from. We have women who wrote about talking to Muslim women, visiting the harems and so on. Women were very explicit also.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And still are, I think. So they had their own world, but the thing is that their words were not written down.
I see. Okay. Interesting. I think that something that's been haunting this discussion is the idea of a world that was in some ways permissive and sexually adventurous coming to an end, right? I feel as though that's something that's been haunting our discussion here. Is it right to say that this culture that generated the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, for example, and the poetry that you've been reading is it right to say that that culture did come to an end? And if it did, when did it end and how did it end?
Yeah, it came to an end. The time we live in now, for many, it's completely forgotten and very, very, very foreign. But the time we live in today is very much shaped by European domination.
And this is where you talked about modernity earlier.
Yes.
So this is the big traumatic break
yes.
when European colonization happens in the Islamic world.
And Orientalists and others who traveled to the Orient, so to speak, depicted these sexual mores of the Muslim as degenerated. They saw expressions of homoerotic love, perhaps, in public, or men could talk about it in public, not sex, but love, and they could and also, so that's one thing that came to an end, this homoerotic expressions.
And is that because European colonial administrators stamp it out?
Partly, but there should be also internal changes. Because it was always condemned by Islamic scholars, because it's illicit, so it was always. So these two together. But instead, we saw less, this gender segregation started to...
intensify?
No, other way.
Oh, really? You get less gender segregation?
Yes, by modernity, I think.
So that's quite paradoxic, actually, right? Like men and women are meeting and hanging out more. but the culture of sexual permissiveness declines.
In one way,
That's quite interesting. It also sounds as though you've got something coming from the outside, this European colonial project, right, which is very much its own thing. But there's also tendencies that have always been there, right? That there's a more conservative way of thinking about sexuality in the countryside, for example, or amongst the more pious scholars. So it's not a sort of total overnight change where something just comes in and everything is suddenly smashed.
No,
right? No,
exactly.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it sounds also from what you're saying that today in the Muslim world, this literature is largely forgotten or taboo in some way.
The last decades, I would say, the last years and decades, there have started to become more and more editions of these, for example, the erotic manuals. There are some editions. So people are reading them. But I also think that people find them problematic in many ways. Not only because they depict illicit sex, that's problematic for pious Muslims, but also because they also depict pederasty.
Right.
And slavery. That is something that people can't accept today. So I think that people don't know exactly what to do with them and how to interpret them. We have to talk more about these and do more research about them.
And potentially, would that include addressing an Arabic-speaking public today?
That would be good, I think, yes. It's still a taboo in the Arab world, in major parts of the Arab world.
We're getting towards the end of our time here. I want to finish by asking you a more personal note, really. Are there particular challenges researching this material as a non-Arab and as a woman?
No, the other way around. The challenges are, of course, the language and the context and everything. But I think it has been easier for me to research them as a non-Arab, perhaps as a woman as well, I don't know. But I've always been well received. And also as a Swedish scholar, it was easier for me to get funding for this research. And also because I come from a country that is rather progressive when it comes to sex and how to talk about sex. So it's been easier for me to talk about it. But today we see more and more, especially young Muslim scholars from working in perhaps Western universities and so on, who's doing research on this, because it has been it's still in many ways an unexplored area.
Yeah, there's still lots of material left.
Absolutely,
left to write about, left to research.
If you had this kind of material in European languages, there would be hundreds and thousands of scholars working on it. But
so that could be a next frontier.
Absolutely,
young Muslim scholars, in Europe and North America, perhaps.
Yeah, that's what we see now.
That's fascinating. Well, I really look forward to reading the work that they produce in the years to come, and I've really enjoyed reading your work as well, Pernilla. So thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.
The Chronicles was funded by Aarhus Universitets Forskningsfond. Sound production and original music was by Kirsi Tilk of Tilk Sonics. If you're interested in news and events at the Centre, you can visit our website at cas.au.dk/cvm. I've been Richard Cole. Thank you for listening.